Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good week, all things considered. For this week, we're going to be taking a look at the 16th century. So we're moving on from last week where we talked about the 15th century. And we're going to start with the Italian High Renaissance. And so continuing on with a lot of the themes that we touched on with the Florentine Renaissance. And then after the break, we'll move up north again, and we'll talk about the Northern Renaissance in the 16th century and the real pivotal event that's going to constitute everything is the Protestant Reformation. So we'll talk about that at the second half. But let's start with the Italian High Renaissance. And we're in for a number of highlights here. A lot of people consider the High Renaissance, one of the high points. Some people consider it the high point of Western art. So, and a lot of these are very, very famous works. And you're going to notice we're going to get all the Ninja Turtles in the gallery today. So let's go forward with the High Renaissance, and it's helpful to situate it time-wise and also thematically. So some of the themes that we talk about that come out of the High Renaissance aesthetic. So where are we talking about? When are we talking about? We're mainly in Florence and Rome, and this is the Italian Renaissance, and about 1480 to 1520s. That's the sweet spot, the High Renaissance. Almost every art movement has a early, middle, high, and late period, and the high is usually considered to be, the most fully developed moment of that movement. So the High Renaissance is usually deemed to be the most developed, some say the most perfect manifestation of the Renaissance. So let's talk about some of the key themes. All of these are going to be very second nature to you now. This is going to be old hat. There's a lot of what we've talked about last week, but just taken to a higher key, perfected in many ways. So we're going to talk about naturalism, incredible naturalism in many of these works. So, of course, an influence from classical Greece. This is, after all, the Renaissance. The compositional element, where last week we had a number of different formal compositions playing out in the pictures that we looked at. It's often said that there's a certain endemic compositional style in the High Renaissance, and that's to have a pyramid or a triangle, this triangular sculpture. And there's a reason why the pyramids have been there for so long. The triangle, the pyramidal composition, is a very stable, very secure composition. So a lot of the High Renaissance compositionally is going to be very stable, and like that beautiful Radiohead song, everything will be in its right place. That's very much part of the Renaissance style. There's also going to be a little bit of restraint and clarity. So some of the work, definitely when we were looking at works up north, it can be very busy, and it might take quite some time to unpack all the details, all the elements within the painting. In the High Renaissance, this is not going to be the case. In some ways, you're going to kind of be able to see everything all at once. It's just going to work so beautifully, so cohesively. And so there's more restraint in the formal elements, and there's more clarity. These are all just helpful signposts. It's not going to apply to everything, but there is some truth to some of these themes. And so even if we're talking about a pyramid composition and clarity, it doesn't mean that they're going to look simple. It doesn't mean that these images in the High Renaissance are going to look, like easily symmetrical, or it's going to be easy to pick out how everything is just working so beautifully. There is a sense in which there's a unified whole, which sometimes will prove elusive, sometimes it'll be somewhat obvious, where every single part works together. So there's an emphasis on this unified totality of a dynamic interrelationship of all the components. We look at a lot of painting in the High Renaissance, and so the compositions are going to be clear, but not reductive. There are going to be elements that sort of play off each other, and it's going to be our job to sort of find how these artists came up with this wonderful balance. Then perhaps even more than the Florentine Renaissance, and definitely more than up north, which was a little less, there was less an emphasis on idealization. There was more of an emphasis on what nature actually looks like, what naturalism can actually evoke. In the High Renaissance, there's going to be a pretty big emphasis on idealization. Vasari, who's writing not too far after this, considered to be the first art historian, he's one of the first to lionize and praise the High Renaissance. He's writing about all these guys, and he says that in the High Renaissance, painters, artists can actually one-up nature. They can do better than nature. So you have this emphasis on idealization as actually going even beyond natural beauty. So we'll have to decide if they in fact succeed, right? We'll see. And then these are the three. These are the three big dogs of the High Renaissance: Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. So they make up the High Renaissance style. There are other artists, but these are the three major artists. And you'll see it starts, we're talking about the 16th century today when we're getting into it, but notice, like I said before, we're starting in the 1480s, and this is because Leonardo is the oldest. Raphael and Michelangelo are closer to the same age, and they're younger than Leonardo da Vinci, and he starts earlier, so he's path-breaking. He's incredibly important and formative as a figure. So we're going to go somewhat in order. We're going to start with Leonardo, talk a bit about him, look at some of his really important works. Then we'll talk about Raphael, and then we'll end with Michelangelo. So Leonardo, just a brilliant person. There used to be a name for someone who could do just about everything, and this would be called a Renaissance man. Today would say Renaissance person. And Leonardo definitely was that. So he's ahead of his time, not only when it comes to painting, sculpture, architecture, but he was also coming out with breakthroughs in engineering, military science, anatomy, geology, geography, hydraulics, optics, all these things. He was just this polyglot, this guy who just studied everything and seemed to be good at everything. There's a very famous letter that he writes to the Duke of Milan to get a job, basically. So this is like us when we're applying for jobs. We have a cover letter, and we try to sell ourselves. We try to say how good we are and that we should get the position. So Leonardo writes this long letter, and he's talking about all his achievements, everything in science, everything in mathematics, his inventions, everything, right? And then only at the end does he say, "Oh yeah, I'm also a pretty good painter," which is kind of funny because, of course, what we're going to study most today, and what he's most known for, I think, in the world, would be his paintings. And there he is, self-drawing. You probably know, this is very, very famous. If you don't, that's okay. Leonardo has a copious amount of journals and sketchbooks. So we know quite a bit about what he thought and his studies. So it's like having the sketches, the diary of this brilliant person living and straddling the 15th and 16th century. So I wanted to show you a few of some of the more famous or some of the more interesting drawings. This is very likely his most famous drawing. You've probably seen it riffed on somewhere. This is the Vitruvian Man. It's named after a Roman thinker, Vitruvius. And this is Leonardo's rendering of basically the perfect human being. And notice how the perfect human being, well, one is a man. They were definitely a ways away before we get to female artists, and an emphasis on both the sexes. This is a man, and he is measured by. His perfection is measured by geometry. So notice these two elementary shapes. He's within a circle and he's within a square. You're seeing him sort of with his arms spread out in two different ways. So you get to see and his anatomy. And Leonardo was definitely studying. He was ahead of his time. If I remember correctly, it was actually still illegal to be studying cadavers and to be dissecting, so he had to do it secretly. But he's one of the first in the Renaissance to study anatomy, to study from the human body from life. And so he's very much into mathematics and beauty and human form as in some ways coinciding. And this should be familiar because this sounds a lot like Greek principles, right? So let no one who is not a mathematician read my principles. This is Leonardo. And we should know he was a bit of a curmudgeon. He was a bit of a misanthrope. He seemed to be tough on a lot of people. He wrote backwards. Some say he wrote backwards so that in order to be able to read his writing, you would need a mirror. I think that's been contested, but we'd have to do further research on that. So maybe there was some sort of, he was trying to be somewhat secretive or furtive with his principles and with his writings. But whatever the case might be, he definitely considered himself an elite in many ways. So he's definitely a person after my own heart, because Leonardo is one of those first to be in many ways like an animal advocate. He used to buy birds or animals that were in cages at the market and then go and release them. He was vegetarian, and he had very, very strong, harsh words against those who would be cruel or who would be violent towards animals. So this is a quote that's attributed to him from his writings. Endless multitudes will have their little children taken from them, ripped open and flayed and most cruelly cut to pieces. So he's using very, very graphic language of how humans treat animals and how we continue to treat them today in so many ways, without any justification or really any coherent ethics. So he's an early advocate of nature and of animals. So he's interesting in that sense. So this kind of curmudgeon, elite sort of misanthrope, and yet on the other hand has all this sentiment and all this love for nature and for animals. So he's a romantic before we have romantics. We'll talk about that in a few centuries. Above all, when it comes to art, he privileged vision. So he thought that vision was the most noble sense. And this is a bias that a lot of people will have. Someone like Hegel, later on in the 19th century, will say that the window to the soul is through the eyes. So there's something about the eyes that are somehow the most noble, the most important sense for the human body. And so vision above all is what's important for Leonardo. And you're going to see this in the paintings. Like, he's studying optics, he's studying how vision works, and he's really coming up with some incredible breakthroughs, not only on the science of optics, but also how you see a painting and how you can replicate the world in paint so that you're replicating the way we actually see as human beings. So vision is really, really important. And so above all, he considered himself a painter. And this is one of his early works, the Madonna of the Rocks, from 1483 to 86. It's an altarpiece that he did. He was commissioned to do it, I believe, if I remember correctly, by a group of nuns, Carmelite nuns. And right off the bat, you see the staples of the High Renaissance aesthetic. So you're seeing an incredible emphasis on naturalism. You're seeing an incredible emphasis on nature. You're seeing the triangular pyramidal composition. So you see these figures in the foreground. They're incredibly stable. Your eye is constantly running this triangular circuit, which we'll talk about more in a second. So very, very, very stable, very naturalistic, and highly idealized. Right? These are very, very beautiful, beautiful figures. And so who are these people? I think it should be clear This is Madonna of the Rocks, so the Virgin Mary for Christians. She's more or less in the center of the composition. Under her arm this gets confusing. It can get confusing. Sometimes people mix it up. But this is not Christ. This is St. John the Baptist. So she has her arm. Look at that passage. It's such a beautifully delicate hand just resting on the shoulder of this chubby little baby, right? It's just incredible. She has his hand on St. John the Baptist, which then, of course, means that this is Christ. And this is an angel. Okay? An angel sort of filling out the scene. And in fact, the angel is propping up the baby Christ here. So you have a circuit of eyes, of people looking. You have a circuit, you're being directed by hands. It's actually really quite complex. So a very clear, stable composition, but an incredibly complex set of gestures. So we talked about this hand here that's sort of holding very lovingly the baby St. John the Baptist. St. John the Baptist is praying, or in some ways paying homage, showing piety towards Christ. Christ in return is blessing St. John the Baptist. Christ is being held up by this arm of the angel, and she's looking kind of down. No one's looking at us. She's the closest to be looking, or he is the closest to be looking at us. And the finger of the angel is pointing to St. John the Baptist. Then the circuit here, the triangular circuit composition, is finished by the hand of Mary, which is hovering straight over the head, protectively over Jesus, over the Christ baby here. So a very wonderful circuit of hand gestures and of looks, right? We're in a natural landscape, this very craggy sort of natural landscape. They actually think that it's near the Dolomites, which is a famous mountain range in northern Italy that Leonardo would have seen. So he's actually embedding this scene in a real, I think he's probably embellished. There's this fantastic grotto kind of quality to it, but he's probably taken from nature and then idealized it. They're also at the bed of water here, and this would be symbolic for the commission, because Christ is here by the water and St. John the Baptist is by the water. In the New Testament, St. John the Baptist is the one who baptizes Christ in the Jordan River. So there would be a symbolic resonance to this. And so we're talking about these religious figures. We're talking about this history of Christianity, but notice one thing, and I think this is the first time you've seen this all history. There's not one thing in here that would make you think of a metaphysical or transcendent or divine state. There's no golden backdrop. There are no miracles. There aren't even any halos. There are no halos, right? These look like lovely but very real, naturalistic human beings, babies and adults, right? And notice how we actually have babies now, chubby little babies, rather than just the small little men that usually painters were painting. So Leonardo is making breakthroughs at the level of representation and naturalism that we've just never seen before. He uses a few techniques that are good to know. One is chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is an Italian word that means shading from light to dark, moving from light to dark. And sometimes chiaroscuro can be very heavy, and it is quite heavy here. Look at the Christ baby in the front there. Look at the shading on the back, on the arm, and on the bottom of the legs. And then the front of him is sort of bathed in this light that it's very unclear where the light source is coming from. It almost seems like the light source, this luminous golden light, is coming from the skin itself of these figures, right? But this chiaroscuro is actually quite heavy, this oscillation from light to dark. And what this does is it creates a real palpable, very fleshy, very plump, sort of weighty feel like you get the sense of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional plane. So chiaroscuro is very, very important. We've seen it before, but Leonardo really quite perfects it. So it's a good time to introduce this term. And we'll see lots of different artists working with chiaroscuro from here on out to great effect. The other term that's synonymous with Leonardo, and he's really the one who takes this far, is sfumato, which means smoky or hazy. And as I was saying before, he was interested in optics and the way we see, and this relates back to atmospheric perspective. He wanted the whole, even this divine, for Christians, even this divine scene, he wanted the whole thing to be bathed in a unified atmosphere, a unified ambiance, right? He didn't want the figures to look like they're disjointed or somehow not part of the landscape, a part of the backdrop of this craggy this craggy scene. And so what he does is he creates this sort of smoky haziness that runs throughout the whole painting. Notice how very soft the figures are, very soft the whole painting is. It's as if the whole thing is bathed in its own haze, in its own, feels rather humid ambiance, right? So this is a technique that he used to great effect. There are actually 2 versions of Madonna of the Rocks. This one is in Paris in the Louvre, and this one is in London in the National Gallery. They're not clear as to why he did 2. What's funny is that Leonardo very famously, he's one of the the great painters in history, but he had a hard time finishing paintings, and there aren't that many of them. So it's weird to have someone who had a hard time finishing paintings finish 2 paintings that are very similar from each other. Right, so they have the similar composition. The colors are different. You do have halos in the London version, and it does seem a bit crisper. I've seen them both in person. Honestly, I like the Louvre one better, but they're both pretty amazing paintings. So that's a good introduction to Leonardo, but we should move forward and talk about what's probably his most important and probably his most well-known painting, and that's The Last Supper. So I always show the Last Supper in situ first, in the place that it's at. So this is in the refectory, basically the cafeteria of a monastery where the monks would eat here, right? And so I show it to you inside the space itself because Leonardo did something pretty amazing. This is the painting. It's a fresco. So these were all oil on wood panel. We're back to fresco. So this is all the paint here. But notice how he's used, we're going to come back to this, he's used single point perspective to create this illusion that the painting is actually recessing back into space, as if the wall is just the window onto a continuation of the space. And it's fitting, right? It's fitting to have the Last Supper, this scene from the New Testament, in a space where religious functionaries would eat, right? Where these monks would eat. So it's important to see it in situ. It's gone through a lot. When I show it to you up close, you're going to see how it's damaged. This building has gone through a lot. It's gone through bombings during wars. This painting barely survived a bombing at one point. At some point, much earlier, the monks decided to put a door and cut straight into part of the fresco, which sounds kind of bizarre. Now this door has been plastered over, but still, that part of the fresco is damaged. And so here it is up close, and you can tell. Not the best condition. A lot of it feels like it's been like worn away. A lot of it looks like it's been rubbed off or something like that. It's in very poor condition. It's very, very famously a work that's been conserved over and over and over again, cleaned and conserved because it's highly unstable. And what's funny is that Leonardo was this genius, but sometimes even geniuses get it wrong. Even during his time, the painting started to degrade. And this is because he used a very experimental, the experts are still not quite sure of the mix that he used, but it was a weird mixture of oil and tempera and something else on plaster. And it wasn't wet plaster either. Wet plaster, everything stays more, everything when it dries, it just like goes right into the plaster, and then it's really durable. But he basically wanted to be like a fresco, tempera, but still be able to use oil, have the qualities of oil so that it's more lustrous, so that he can take his time. The problem is that it was a highly unstable combination of materials of this paint, and even during his lifetime, it started to decay, it started to erode, and it started to get damaged. Nonetheless, it is one of those masterpieces of the Western tradition. And it shows a really important scene for Christians, right? The Last Supper, the breaking the bread, the washing of the feet. This is right before in the Garden of Olives, where Christ will get in the New Testament, where he'll get betrayed and arrested, and then ultimately tried and crucified. And Leonardo gives you the most dramatic moment in the whole story, and it's the moment where Christ, in the center of the banquet here, he says, "One of you is going to betray me." A very famous line from the text. One of you is going to betray me. And so what you're getting is this moment where everybody's asking, or everybody's asking in astonishment, like, who's going to betray him? Is it me? Some of them, like this one here, these are all his apostles. It looks like he's saying, "Oh man, it might be me." Others are talking amongst themselves. It's this really, really dramatic moment. Of course, we all know who it was. It's Judas, and you can tell where Judas is for a number of reasons. Leonardo has made him look darker, and he has this dark beard, somewhat more nefarious. This sort of darker element. Some people have read sort of unfortunate racial undertones to this, as if darker is not as good. There's also his elbow on the table. So in the text it says the one who betrays him has the elbow on the table, and he's also spilling the salt on the table. It's hard to see that, but he's spilling the salt, which is also a bad omen. And he's also already holding the silver that he's been given, paid for by the Romans to betray Christ. So he's right here, and everyone else is asking, is it me? Who is it? It's just this incredibly dramatic moment. If you've seen the Da Vinci Code, the Da Vinci Code tries to convince you that this is, I forget, Mary Magdalene, I think, right? But almost every scholar is in agreement that this is not, it's not Mary Magdalene. It's just one of the apostles. So we'll leave it there. There are all sorts of other amazing things about this painting. Leonardo was obsessed with mathematics. We talked about this before. So some scholars have gone in and they noticed that with the bread rolls and the stuff that's arranged on the table, he actually used the golden mean, this golden ratio, which is supposed to be this perfect mathematical ratio. And then the other thing, of course, is the composition and this sort of masterful use of linear perspective. And I can give you the grid. So you'll remember from last week when we looked at Masaccio how linear perspective works. We have the horizon line, we have the vanishing point, and we have the orthogonals. And then everything is converging onto the vanishing point that's situated on the horizon line, right? So you really get a sense that this space, these are all, sometimes this looks like these are columns, like this is negative space, but it's not. These are tapestries on the wall. So you really get a sense that this wall and this space is receding backwards. And then the way in which the composition is ordered, fittingly enough, in the symbolic way, it dead ends right in the forehead of the figure of Christ in the center, who himself is this triangular composition that keeps everything very, very stable. There may very well be also numerology in this. So we have groups of 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4 groups of 3, and then 6 on each side. So this incredible symmetry. maybe you wouldn't see at first because of the way these figures have been placed. But nonetheless, you have this incredible symmetry and use of important numbers and groupings. So we'll move on from Leonardo. Notice I didn't show you the Mona Lisa. She's so famous, and you've seen her so many times. It's hard to even talk about that painting. So if you're interested in that painting, just go to the text and read up about it or look at it. But we won't have time to talk about her. I have seen her in person. She's at the Louvre. It's a very small painting, and there's always so many people around it that it can't help but be disappointing. But maybe one day you get to see it, and there isn't a big crowd, and you'll get to see why so many people love that painting. But for now, we'll move on to Raphael, and we're going to talk about probably his most famous work, which is the Philosophy Frieze. But before we go and look at it directly, I do want to show you where it is. We're in Rome now. We're in the Vatican. The Vatican is a very, very large building where you can find the Pope. And this room was really important. This was the Stanza della Signatura. This was the room where the Pope, and back then in the High Renaissance, you had a very, very important Pope that had the papacy. It was Pope Julius II. And he was very much a humanist Pope. He was a Renaissance humanist Pope. He was, of course, the Pope and Christian and into theology, but he was also into classical knowledge. He was also into championing artists and writers that were part of the Renaissance. So he's really, really important. This is where he would sign official documents. This is basically where he had his library and where he would do important work like signing documents. And he was also responsible for commissioning tons and tons and tons of work. He was a real champion of culture and the arts. And the most coveted commission at the time was the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which we'll talk about at the end of the first part of class today. Raphael really wanted that. He considered himself the best painter. He really wanted that. He didn't get it, unfortunately, for him anyways. What he did get would probably be second best, would be this signature room, the Stanza della Signatura. And he got to do 4 different frescoes inside this room. And they all have to do with a key branch of knowledge. So one is theology, one is medicine, one is poetry, and then the fourth, the one that's the most famous, the one that we're going to study at length, is philosophy. So notice a preoccupation not only with theology, with religion, and Christian religion, but also a preoccupation with classical philosophy, also a preoccupation with poetry, and also preoccupation with science, with medicine. Right? So very interesting moment. So let's look at the School of Athens, or the Philosophy Frieze. So you can call it whatever you like. The nickname is School of Athens, or you can just call it philosophy. It's fine either way. It's by Raphael, and he did it. We're now into the 16th century, 1509 to 1512, with help from assistants. And you notice right off the bat, like the Last Supper, this incredible use of single point perspective. So notice these Roman, you should know these architectural features, right? These are very clearly Roman triumphal arches. And there's one after the other. So here's a big one. And then there's another one in the back. And then one in the back. And it's all syncing up perfectly with your orthogonals that all end. The vanishing point is right in the middle of these two figures, right at the center. So he's using this beautiful linear perspective. And he's also working with the representational space of the wall, and he's playing off the real space of the room itself, right? So all of this is a door, all of this is part of the room itself, but he's making it look as if it's hard to tell what the painted space is. It almost bleeds and works organically and naturally with the actual architectural space of the signature room. So really this incredible sense, and I've seen this in person, this incredible sense where it's almost as if you think you could walk up onto the ledge and walk into the painting. That's how beautifully rendered it is. And that's how wonderfully synced up it is between the illusory three-dimensional space of the painting and the actual space of the room you're standing in. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful painting. So the theme is philosophy, and not just any philosophy. All of the key important philosophical schools and figures of the ancient world, or at least of Athens, or at least of Greece, right? So they're all together here. So let's go in and look at a few of them. The two in the center, it's very obvious. These are the two most important thinkers of the classical world, and probably the two of the most important thinkers for the whole history of the Western tradition, the Western intellectual tradition. There's really no question about it. So on the left, he's older, is Plato. He's got this beard, and he's pointing upwards. On the right is Aristotle. He's a little younger. He still has color in his hair. He hasn't gone all white. And he's not pointing down, but he's sort of gesturing down to the ground. And so what you have here in the very center, and remember the vanishing point is right here. What you have in the center here are the two competing schools of thought of the classical world, which some way are going to inform all later schools of philosophy, of thinking throughout the whole history of the West, probably still today. So Plato, if you've already studied, philosophy 101, you'll probably know these ideas already. If not, you have a treat to look forward to. So Plato wrote all these wonderful dialogues, and Plato is what we would call an idealist. He's someone who thinks that reality, the truth, and all these good things like justice, like goodness, like beauty, where they really reside, their true essence is in some conceptual ideal world. He called it the world of the forms. They're not here. They're not part of our fleshy, terrestrial, mundane, material world. Everything here, like this mic I'm talking into, like the plant that I'm looking at, like my chair, this desk, they tap into the ideas, to the forms. There's a perfect Platonic essence of chair, of microphone, of plant, of what have you. But they only pale in comparison to that idea, to that concept. So that's where they get the term ideal. He's an ideal philosopher. So naturally, he's pointing upwards. He's saying truth, the real reality, is conceptual. It's in the realm of the forms. Aristotle saying no way. Aristotle is what we would call an empiricist. Aristotle is saying that no, reality, truth, is right here. We got nothing but this. This is the world. This is where we are. This is where you find truth. So he's much more into natural observation. Aristotle is groundbreaking for history of science. He's one of the first to catalog animals, animal species. So he thinks knowledge comes from the observation of reality as everyday life, of the real, of the material. So they actually order the whole painting. If you have Plato here, he's pointing out he's an idealist. All the figures here on this side of the painting fall more along the lines of Platonic idealism, whereas Aristotle is more of an empiricist or a materialist, and then most of the figures on his side of the fresco are also empiricists or materialists. So it's a really wonderful way of structuring this painting. And Raphael's done another little thing that focuses that dual thematic even further, just by the color of the dress that they're wearing. Plato is wearing purple and red, and Aristotle is wearing blue and this kind of olive brown sort of color. So these might seem like minor details, but actually for Greek thinkers, they comprise the four elements of reality. So for Aristotle, the elements that are associated with him, because they're more earthbound and material, would be earth and water. Whereas the elements that seem to rise upwards, that tend towards more the ideal, would be fire, which is represented by red, and air, which is represented by purple. So even the color of the clothes that they're wearing signify their philosophies and this split in the Western tradition between idealist and materialist. One last thing. Plato should look somewhat familiar. Extra points if you can remember who Raphael has used as the face for Plato. And if you thought, wow, that looks like Da Vinci, well, you were right. He used Da Vinci's likeness as an homage to depict Plato. So who are some of these other characters in here? Socrates, very, very important. Socrates, there he is. When you read Plato's dialogues, the main character is his teacher, Socrates, who never wrote a thing. Socrates didn't really believe in writing. He said, what you got to do as a philosopher, you go and talk people's ears off. And you use what's now known as the Socratic Method, which is basically to ask questions until everybody realizes the stuff that they thought they knew, they really have no idea what they're talking about. There's so many questions sort of unmask the fact that people's beliefs and ideas don't hold up to questioning. So this is kind of wonderful. This is called a dialectic method, a method of dialogue, but it can also be dangerous, right? If you make very powerful people upset, and you show them that they actually don't know what they know, that all the principles and the ideas that they held actually don't pass the muster, you can be in danger, and that's why Socrates, long story short, was killed. Was put to death in a trial. So if you want to know all about the life of Socrates, read the Apology and all these wonderful dialogues that Plato wrote about him. On the left, we also have Pythagoras, who's an important mathematician. He was also one of the first to theorize music. So he's a wonderful thinker, and you probably know Pythagoras' theorem. You also have Heraclitus. He's still on the Plato side, here at Plato's feet. Heraclitus is an interesting thinker. He's a pre-Socratic thinker. He comes before Socrates. And he basically argued that life is all in a flux. That saying, you never step into a river twice, comes from Heraclitus. And there he is, brooding in the front. And it's thought that he's actually... this is a portrait of Michelangelo, who we'll talk about in a second. So on the right, on the more material side with Aristotle, here we have Euclid. You probably know Euclid, the father of geometry. You also have Ptolemy and Zoroaster. So the first, let's say, astrologists, physicists. You also have this guy that's looking at you, maybe slightly creepy. That's actually Raphael himself. He's put himself in the school of Athens. So I guess if you're the painter, you can do that, right? And then spread out lewdly on the steps here, right at sort of at the feet of Aristotle. This is often said to be Diogenes. So he was a cynic. The cynics were really interesting. Cynic comes from the word dog, so he liked the company of dogs more than humans. He lived with dogs in a barrel just outside of Athens, just outside of town. He lived with very little goods of anything. Again, he lived in the barrel. He was he didn't have that many possessions. He would go into town in broad daylight with a lantern and yell at people and say he's looking for actual human beings. So being cheeky and transgressive. There are all sorts of stories about Diogenes. Maybe the most famous has to do with Alexander the Great, who came to visit him, and he told him, I hear you're a great thinker, I hear you're a great philosopher. And he goes up to Diogenes, who at the time is sunbathing just outside his barrel outside of town. And there you have Alexander the Great with his troops, and Alexander saying, you're a great thinker, I'll do anything for you. What would you like me to do? And Diogenes, the only thing he says is, I'd like you to get out of my way. I'd like you to get out of the way of the sun. which is quite incredible to say that to the most powerful person in the world, but it encapsulates his philosophy, which is to not be beholden to power, right? Because once you ask something to be done, once he says, "Oh, I'd like you to do this," then all of a sudden he's caught in a trap. He's beholden to power. He knows that something will be expected of him. So in some sense, Diogenes, the Cynics, are kind of the first libertarians, trying to not be beholden to power and to speak truth to power. So that is the frieze, the philosophy frieze as a whole. It's a really wonderful painting. And now we finish with Michelangelo, so the third of the High Renaissance artists. And this is when he's still in Florence. It's a sculpture. So Michelangelo, above all, unlike Leonardo and Raphael, Michelangelo thought himself to be a sculptor primarily. And the story of this very famous David of his, which I'm sure you've seen before, this is a very famous statue. The story is that the Florentine government, they had this slab of marble left over. They didn't know what to do with it, so they said, "Hey, Michelangelo, just go do something with it." And Michelangelo came out with one of the most iconic, one of the most important statues of the High Renaissance, and maybe in the whole Western tradition. It's really idealized. It looks like a classical Greek statue, but even more idealized. One of the ways in which you can tell is really idealized, because if you stop and think about it, you look at those hands. I mean, that is completely wrong. If you had hands this big in real life, you would look maybe kind of strange. If you had a head this big, you would look kind of strange. But it's in Michelangelo's hands. It somehow works out. It somehow works out, and I've seen this in person. So he's on a pedestal. He's pretty high. He's almost 13 and a half feet high, the statue itself. So he's really, really way bigger than life size. And you're looking up at him. So by looking up at him, the hands and the head being bigger, everything sort of balances out from the vantage point. So if the head were proportioned like how a head should be for a human body, the head might look a little small from looking below. So he took this into account, and he idealized this human form in such a way. And it really is quite incredible, the idealism and the naturalism. You really get a sense of, when you see it in person, there are veins. I mean, this is marble, but you see veins, and you get the sense there's like blood coursing through the veins. You see like the abs and the rib cage and the obliques, the whole stomach. You really get a sense that he's like breathing in. He's like in a moment where he's kind of breathing in. It's quite unbelievable. And in this David, we've seen a David before, Donatello's David, the fourth Ninja Turtle, and we have them all now. It was more young, 5 foot something, like more sort of young, nubile, homoerotic. There certainly is probably something homoerotic about Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo was also probably gay, but much more, let's say, virile or adult or quote-unquote masculine would be Michelangelo's version. Like muscular, just this sort of ideal body for the High Renaissance, and I guess maybe still today. It's amazing how much our ideals of beauty go a long way in the past. And so he's, unlike Donatello, where it's after the fight, you can tell he's breathing in and he's looking off in the distance. He has, there you see him from his face. He's looking off in the distance. He's holding the slingshot. In the other hand, he's holding the stone. And so he's looking down the giant. He's looking down Goliath. So this is before the fighting starts. So it's in some ways, a much more tense, dramatic moment. So it's a really famous statue. And then they are, if we were in class together, I would ask you to write about these two and to compare them. And And you'd really get a sense of what the 15th century was like as compared to the High Renaissance in the early 16th century here. So Michelangelo, much more stocky, much more powerful, and much more idealized in many ways. But when we're talking about Michelangelo, probably the most celebrated work of his, ironically enough, is not a statue. It's the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So remember before I told you Pope Julius II, the most sought after commission was to paint this ceiling. And Raphael really didn't want it. Raphael really wanted it, but it went to Michelangelo. What's funny is that initially Michelangelo refused. He said to Pope Julius II, he said, I don't want it. I'm a sculptor. I can't paint. Don't give me this. I don't want it, right? But you really don't say no to the Pope. So he was more or less forced to undertake this work. And they had something of a, let's say, a frenemy kind of relationship. At one point, Michelangelo, escapes, leaves Rome secretly, and he has to be brought back. And they have a tense relationship. But out of it comes one of the high points of Western painting. So all of these paintings, these are all paintings by famous people. And this is also a painting by Michelangelo, which we're going to end up talking about next week. But what we focus on is the ceiling. And it's massive. It's vast. It took him 5 years to do. There's a myth that he painted the whole thing lying down. So he had to build scaffolding to be up there to be able to paint. There's a myth that he lied down on his back the whole time. That's actually not true. There was a scaffolding, but he painted standing up and he looked up. And it was so painful after a while to be looking up all the time that he actually developed all sorts of chronic disorders. I think he got like a goiter or something like this in his neck. It sounded really torturous, really grueling to do this work. And it's hard to reproduce. It's hard to photograph. So this is a photograph from inside the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in the Vatican. This is from a book. So you notice there are a lot of figures in this painting. Notice also that it's slightly curved. Right, part of it is curved. The only thing that's really flat is the very center part, but all of this is curved. So you had to take that into account, a little bit like like we'll see next week with Pozzo, incredible ceiling painters. And so all of this comes from the Old Testament. So you have Old Testament kings, you have Old Testament prophets, you have Zechariah here, you have Jonah and the whale here. We definitely don't have time to go in and talk about all these figures that are on the outside. What we do concentrate on are the most famous paintings on the Sistine Chapel, and that's the paintings that run along the center, which is basically the whole book of Genesis. So the first book of the Old Testament. So the creation the creation of the world up through the story of Noah. So the whole book of Genesis in just a few paintings. It's really ambitious. And so we start with the creation of the world. What's funny is that I'm sorry, my heater just kicked on, so that's why you're hearing some that hissing sound. But I'm sure you can still hear me okay, even if it's a little obtrusive. So it starts here, separating light from dark. So this is a personification of God creating the world. This is on the first day, separating light from dark. You have the creation of sun, moon, and planets, the celestial bodies. Here you have personification of God. He's rendered twice. If we move forward, you have separating land from water. And then you get to the creation of Adam, so the first human. This is very likely the most famous painting on the Sistine Chapel, maybe one of the most paintings in history. So here's Adam lying down on the newly made earth, and this is a personification of God, and their hands are about to meet. And this is usually read as God giving the spark of life to the first human, to Adam, for Christians and for Jews and for Muslims. So this is a scene of life giving and life creation, right? And he's coming out of this kind of portal. It's this drapery that almost looks like it's this portal, and underneath his arm, this is often read. This is a woman, and it's often read as Eve, who's about to be born, right? So we have this heavenly sort of divine, godly space, touching, meeting with the creation, with the terrestrial space, right? So it's pretty incredible attempt to evoke the creation of life by Michelangelo. On the next panel, we have the creation of Eve. So feminists have had a problem with this ever since, that woman was born from the rib of Adam, was born from the rib of man while he's asleep here. So there's Eve being born. And notice how the style has changed. So look at this style, or here. I mean, the personification of God, he's like this big, really strong, powerful figure. And the colors. Also notice the colors, right? So you have really, really strong, very muscular human forms. Michelangelo really liked that. These were actually painted later. We're starting back with Genesis, with the first part of the story, but that's the part of the story that he actually painted last. So this is the later style on the Sistine Chapel. It runs 5 years, so his style actually changes over the course of these 5 years. So once you get to creation of Eve, you notice the color is shifting. You notice the way he's depicted the human form is changing. And when you get to the other side, it changes even more. The figures really start to change. The colors start to change. And you can tell that he had a stylistic development while making this over those 4 years. So the next part of the story is original sin. So here's the temptation. Here's Eve taking the apple from the serpent. This is before the fall, right? Actually, I don't think we've seen this representation yet in history in our class. This is before the fall. So they're naked. Everything is fine in Eden. There's no sin. There's no nudity. Everything is copacetic. But then here they're being expelled. And so expelled from Eden, and here they definitely seem like they're feeling shame, and so original sin has happened. And then the tree of knowledge here, and the serpent actually turns into a human figure, which we also haven't seen yet. So it's an interesting depiction of that part of the story. And then we get to the story of Noah. So the sacrifice of Noah. He's unlike everybody else. He sacrifices to God. He's pious, and so he gets the tip that God is planning on basically destroying his creation by flooding everything. And that's where you get on the next panel. You have the flood. So here you have the ark, and here you have all these people that are did make it onto the ark, like Noah and his family and all the animals in pairs. According to the story, all these people are about to drown. And here's a pretty famous father and son duo where the son is actually already dead. So it's a pretty traumatic and dramatic depiction of the flood. And incidentally, if you're interested in this story, well, obviously reading Genesis is a thing to do, but also Aronofsky, that film director Aronofsky, he did a movie called Noah. I don't know if anybody's seen it. But it was quite good. Amazing CGI. All those animals in that film don't actually exist. They're all digital, which he made a point to do it that way because he decided never to use animals in his films after having used them before. So it's an incredible feat just at the level of the CGI. But it's a good story too. And then at the very end, which again is the first one he would have painted. So notice how the style changes. I mean, it's just so clear. Everything becomes much more muscular and restrained, and there's the palette, the key of the colors change. Whereas here, everything is a little busier, a little warmer key, and not as, let's say, the human body is like, there's almost like a steroid quality to the later figures, so strong. Here you have something closer maybe to normal or natural human bodies. So the first story, which is actually the first thing he painted, which is actually the last story in Genesis, has to do with the drunkenness of Noah. It's kind of a strange moment where his son Ham sees his father naked on the beach. Noah had been drinking. Noah was the first person to make wine. He was the first in the Bible. He's noted to be the first person to harvest and make wine. And so the idea is that he didn't know. He drank all this wine, but he didn't know yet that wine would make you drunk. So that really wasn't a sinful thing to do yet. But Ham, the son, seeing his father naked, that was a sin. Like, you shouldn't see your father naked. According to Genesis, and that then is a sin, and he runs into all sorts of problems. So it's this moment where the father Ham is covering his father on the beach. So that's the last part of Genesis. And so the last thing to say about the Sistine Chapel is that it went through a very famous restoration in 1980 to 1994. So this is what it looked like before. And I can tell you, I've been to the Sistine Chapel. It's really bizarre. All the windows are all open. You got car fumes coming, stuff from the city, Rome. It's right in Rome. All this stuff is coming in. It's really incredible. So over the years, over the centuries, you had all this sediment, all this damage settling on the paintings in there, including Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. So it looked like this for the longest time. Very muted colors. Very restrained at the level of colors. But once they cleaned it, like, people couldn't believe how almost neon some of the colors Michelangelo used. There were some art historians who were unwilling to accept that these were actually the colors that Michelangelo used. Some art historians are kind of stodgy, and they think that this is just like garish or like kitsch, or doesn't show the proper classical restraint of what the Renaissance should look like. But in fact, they're very likely the ones who are wrong, that the Renaissance did have this high-key color, and Michelangelo was fond of it. So here's another example. This is the fall and the expulsion. This is pre-cleaning, and then this post-cleaning. So restorations are not without their controversies. Because sometimes people think that restorers or conservators go too far, or there's always the issue or the worry that the cleaning itself will end up damaging what's underneath. So restorations actually are very carefully planned out. They take a long time, and they can actually be controversial. So this is probably the most famous, the restoration of the Sistine Chapel. Okay, everyone. So that's it for the first half of class. Let's go ahead and take the break, and we'll be back for the Northern Renaissance in the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation.